Hello, everyone. Welcome to Teaching with Magic, a podcast exploring the intersection of education, fantasy, and literacy. Here at Teaching with Magic, we explore the different ways that teachers in the fiction and in the real world make magic for their students. You'll hear discussions about teachers and teaching methods in fantasy, science fiction, and pop culture. You'll hear interviews with scholars in various fields about important topics in education, and you'll get to be a part of an ongoing conversation about why the imagination matters. Welcome to Teaching with Magic. Hello, listeners. Welcome back to another episode of Teaching with Magic. I'm your host, Elise Trudell-Cedeno. I've invited a very special guest to join us today. In our last episode, I discussed the basics of the science of reading and how it applies to my teaching, and, by extension, how it applies to fantasy literature and my studies of fantasy literature. For this episode, I got to speak to Dr. Andy Higgins, who is one of the leading experts on J.R.R. Tolkien and language invention. Dr. Andrew Higgins is a Tolkien scholar who received his Ph.D. through Cardiff Metropolitan University on the Genesis of Tolkien Mythology, and co-edited with Professor Dimitra Fimi the book A Secret Vice, Tolkien on Language Invention, published by HarperCollins. He has also published on invented languages in the Star Trek and Star Wars story worlds, and his research focuses on Tolkien and other invented languages and world building. Most recently, his essays on Star Wars and Star Trek languages were published in the series co-edited by Dr. Amy Sturgis and Emily Strand. Andy is the Director of Development at the Imperial War Museums. I'm so glad I got to chat with Andy Higgins about language invention because it's a topic that's been forefront in my mind as I started my new position as an interventionist. What are the foundations of reading and language that Tolkien was so interested in? And how can I bring these ideas into my elementary classroom? Can language invention help my students who struggle with reading? And if so, how? Towards the end of the episode, I asked Andy for some recommendations on further reading and study. You can find all of those titles in the show notes, including a link to the Teaching with Magic bookshop.org affiliate page. Bookshop.org works to connect readers with independent booksellers all over the world. Every purchase on the site financially supports independent bookstores, and I'm proud to use their site for new and used books. If you're interested in some of the books we've mentioned on this episode or throughout the show, you can find a link to the bookshop page in the show notes or on teachingwithmagic.blog. And please note that your purchase earns a small commission for Teaching with Magic, and so we thank you for your support. And so, without further ado, here is Dr. Andy Higgins. Dr. Andy Higgins, tell us about your work. So how did you come to study invented languages?
Well, thank you. I think, of course, as with many people, it all started with Tolkien. My dad read my brother and I The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings when I was like 6 and 7. And I remember my brother would usually fall asleep halfway through, but I was just, and my father did all the voices. He did an amazing Gandalf, I remember. But I was very interested from a very early age in the sounds of the names and whatever we were given in the appendices of the languages. And I remember studying that. And then I remember buying that it's not a very good book, but Ruth Knoll's book about the languages of Middle Earth, and trying to take chapter 2, Shadow of the Past, and turn it into Sindarin and all this. So I was really interested in the makeup of the language, how it was invented, the sound, the what would later become called the phonoaesthetic sense of the language. So it really was through Tolkien that I became interested in it. And I kind of patterned my academic life on Tolkien. I taught myself, I was a classics major. I taught myself Anglo-Saxon and Old Norse and eventually Gothic, and still trying to do Finnish now. And I when I moved over here, I started keeping a blog about Tolkien called Wotan's Elvish Musings, which still exists. And I was translating some of, I think it was one of the poems in the third volume of the History of Middle Earth into Sindarin. It's all still embarrassingly up there. And I took a course with a very brilliant Tolkien scholar named now Professor Dimitra Fimi on Tolkien. And in that course, it was an online course. It's when she was at Cardiff Metropolitan University, and I think she had just published Tolkien Race and Cultural History, which of course is one of the landmarks of Tolkien scholarship. And she realized that I was very interested in the languages because I was doing, I think it was Unit 7, and I was just really participating in that. And we met at a conference in Wales, actually, where actually I met Tom Shippey and Verlin Flieger and Corey Olsen, who walked on the streets of Wales with me and told me about this idea he had for creating this online learning thing. I went, wow, that would be really interesting. And Dimitra kind of convinced me to work more on Tolkien and do a PhD, basically. And so that's when I came up with this idea of doing a PhD and looking at the really early version of the mythology and the original languages that Tolkien had invented for it. So the original version of Quenya and what was then known as Goldogrin or Gnomish, basically, which after several iterations would become Sindarin. And I guess from there, my interest in invented language kind of grew because I needed to do kind of a survey of other invented languages that Tolkien actually had been building upon. And that's when I realized that this invented language thing goes back quite a ways, actually. Matter of fact, there's evidence of it in some Greek tragedies and Aristophanes, but then of certainly probably the patron saint of invented languages is Hildegard von Bingen, who came up with the lingua ignota, which was she basically made up 1,200 words that she then proceeded to kind of put into antiphons and things like that. And then, of course, you have Thomas More's Utopia, which has an original invented language quatrain in it. And then, of course, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver Travels, and then it kind of continues from there. So I realized that there was this history of invented languages, that it didn't start with Tolkien. And so I became very interested in that. And then also I became very interested, especially when Dimitra and I basically identified that in the Bodleian, there were all these unpublished notes and everything from, of course, the seminal talk that Tolkien gave on language invention called The Secret Vice. And we went to HarperCollins and went to Christopher Tolkien and got permission to actually work on that. And that, of course, became the volume that we co-edited called The Secret Vice Tolkien on Language Invention. And one of the things that I worked on in that volume was kind of a coda looking at where language invention had gone since Tolkien. And that's when I got very interested in things like Klingon for Star Trek and the languages that David Peterson invented for the HBO adaptation of Game of Thrones. So it kind of just built from there. And the two chapters I just wrote for the new volumes, the Vernon Press volumes that the amazing dyad of Amy Sturgis and Emily Strand edited, was a way to kind of really explore both the Star Trek and the Star Wars language inventions, which have very interesting kind of conceptions of how they would develop. So yeah, it's kind of going from there. So, Tolkien is my key focus, but then I'm very interested in like the languages that Ursula Le Guin created for Always Coming Home and the Dispossessed, and then also looking at some other examples. And now, of course, in today's world of fantasy, you have to have an invented language. It's become a career. People are hired to invent languages, which I think would have blown old Toller's mind, basically, if he knew that.
I think it would.
So yeah, I think David Peterson is kind of the one who's done it professionally, but there are so many others now. So yeah, so that's kind of the trajectory of how my interest got created.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It really has blown up not just since Tolkien, but since Star Wars and Star Trek became popular culture, I suppose one might say.
Well, and interestingly, when I looked into the whole the Star Trek language invention, especially. I mean, this is a very early example of a fan base actually doing language invention, because while the first season of the original series, or These Old Scientists, if you as they call them now, was on, you had fans inventing a version of the Vulcan language.
Yeah.
Before the episode of Mock Time even ran originally. And so you have these fans creating this thing called the Nevar, a word which would later be brought into the canon. So it's a really great example of not only early language invention in these kind of media projects, but also the fans, kind of what, Henry Jenkins calls about textual poachers, these fans getting involved with the world and everything and inventing their own languages.
Yeah. So that, I suppose that leads to a later question that I have written, but perhaps I'll ask it now.
Sorry.
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, teachers, we think on our feet. What does an invented language need in order to be a language, rather than just random syllables and letters and sounds mashed together that sound like an invented language? Like, what makes it a language rather than I suppose the first instance that comes to my mind is boxing. I know C.S. Lewis was playing around with an invented language, but it didn't really have a pattern so much as Tolkien's invented languages did, and other invented languages. So then what's that criteria that makes an invented language?
Yeah, it's good questions. Well, let's start with Tolkien. So Tolkien really believed in kind of what he talks about in The Secret Vice, is a language needs 4 characteristics, basically. One, and especially important for him, was creations of word forms that sounded aesthetically pleasing. So the idea of phonoaesthetics, and that even if you don't know what the word means, the sound of it gives you a sense of it, basically. And of course, the whole phonoaesthetics thing is an interesting thing, because if you look at more traditional language theory, you have the idea that there is no association. This is what Saussure talked about. There's no association between a word and the meaning. So the idea of a dog, let's say, and the word dog only exists because we have a social understanding that object that you see in your head is a dog, and the word dog means it. It could also be chien. It could also be lots of other things in other languages. But there was another theory, and this is kind of what was going on in kind of the 1920s and 30s with more modernist theories about language, is that some sounds have an inherent meaning built within them. And there was lots of work done on this, and you could read A Secret Vice. Dimitra and I did some stuff on this in there. So like anything that, like with an I vowel, for example, sounds small, even though you don't know the words, like teeny and tiny and all this kind of stuff. So Tolkien believed that a language should have some sense of that, basically. This idea of the fitness between the sound and the meaning of the word. So even if you don't know what Ashnaz the Batical, Ashnaz Gimbatul means, it gives you a sense of it. It doesn't sound very good, does it?
Right.
As opposed to Ailari Lanti Lasi Suinin, which is, the beginning of Namadia, or of an Elvish poem. But the other thing, Tolkien, because Tolkien was at heart a philologist, and what Tolkien was very interested in is the structure and the development of language, is a language should have some form of grammar. It should have some structure. And Tolkien was notorious for writing out complete grammars and basing them very much on the historical grammars that he would have read as a philologist. But the intricacies of verb forms and noun forms and prefixes and suffixes, and usually a lot of these grammars start out really good, and then he kind of peters out when he gets to verb forms and stuff like that. And of course, because it was his language, he had the right to change it anytime he wanted to, basically. So if he decided he wanted to express the passive tense in a different way, he did. And so for Tolkien's studies of Tolkien's language, that's why I always laugh when people say they want to learn Elvish. I think, well, what version of Elvish do you want to learn? Do you want to learn the early version? There is no one Elvish, because he kept changing it over the years. And then I think for Tolkien, the last thing, and probably we get here into Verlin Flieger's favorite bumper sticker, and that is that the language must have a relation to the stories and the peoples who speak them. So language is mythology. Mythology is language. Language is mythology. The tongue are coeval in this world, which is what he says in Secret Vice and in On Fairy Stories. So that Tolkien believed, and this is where a lot of the, I think it's clear now that, Tolkien was working on story writing and language invention kind of concurrently, and they came together, especially when you look at something like his work on the early version of the Kullervo story, which he was writing in like 1912, somewhere around in the 19s, when he starts to make up names for things in the original Kalevala poem. So he starts to see how myth and language come together, basically. So that idea of, and of course, it becomes inextricably linked in it. Tolkien beliefs start with a name and then the story follows and everything. So I think that now there are different variants on that. If you look at, for example, the Star Wars languages or the Star Trek languages, but I think most invented languages have some forms basically of a structure, of a grammar, of a vocabulary, of a morphology, etc.
Thank you for that. That's very helpful. So then to go off of what you just said about Verlin Flieger's bumper sticker, so what do invented languages reveal about our own languages? Maybe we can start with English for our purposes. what do invented languages reveal about culture, myths, mythologies? You gave the Kalevala and Tolkien as a great example. Can you think of other examples?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things they allow us to do, because, in many ways, Tolkien reverse engineered his language invention, is it allows us to see how languages develop and change, and how when they're confronted by other peoples, let's say, how that changes, for example. And Tolkien was very, very aware of this. He knew that, he wanted to be able to create a language system where you could trace a word back from, let's say, all you have to do is look at the etymologies in the History of Middle Earth, Book 5, how you could trace a word back to a root, because Tolkien believed, he had the elves waking up at Cuiviénen. I mean, I really think, and the more I delve into this, and someday I'll write a paper about it, when Tolkien said that, that my mythology is linguistic, it is linguistic. I think what he's meaning there is that his whole story of the elves and how they were, they awoke in Cuiviénen, and then for 300 or so years, they were by themselves, and then the Valar discovered them, and then they were invited to the West, and how they start to go to the West, and through that, their languages start to splinter and change, is a mapping, essentially, of what happened with the Indo-European languages, which again is a construct, because there was no Indo-European language. But we in the 19th century grammarians, created this whole idea of that you can look back and trace things back. So if you look at what Jakob Grimm did and people like that, they were able to say, if you take this word and you trace it back, it must go back to a common root based on all these different vowel changes and things like that, like Grimm's law. And I refer you to anything that Nelson Goering has written on that, and Tom Shippey for that matter. So I think that's through language invention, we're actually able to learn, because we're not around. I think the other interesting thing about language, we're not around long enough on this world to really see language change. We can see some trends, and certainly now with texting and things like that, you hear people speak sometimes, the young kids, and you think, what are they saying? But, we're not around long enough to see the big changes in language. Whereas the elves, of course, and Tolkien writes about this, they're around forever. They get to see how languages change and stuff like that. So the great elvish lore masters were actually able to write about that. So I think that's one of the things that through language invention, we have a chance to look kind of at a micro and macro development of a language and how it changes when it comes in contact with people. And so when you look at some of the early languages Tolkien developed, like the original Goldegrin or Gnomish, he talks about how that language then came into contact when the Noldoli were exiled to the Great Lands, which would later become Middle Earth, with other races, including goblins, So yeah, I think it's a great laboratory for understanding language, which is something we're not around long enough to really understand, basically. If that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense, yes. Elves, they could certainly see those changes, and those changes impacted their lives and their mythology and vice versa.
Well, and Tolkien he grapples with that in one of the later essays he wrote, which I gave a paper on at some point, where he talks about the fact that, well, if the elves are around, how does the language change then? Because they have, Elrond is able to remember all the way back. Frodo says, how can you remember this? He said, well, I was there. So yeah, it's an interesting. It's in the last volume, I think, of the History of Middle Earth, and it's worth a read if you're interested in that.
Absolutely. So has the criteria for what makes an invented language changed over the years, and especially with modern shows like Game of Thrones and Star Trek? Have they contributed to what makes an invented language a language? You mentioned morphology, you mentioned phonetics, and of course, grammar and the stories behind the language. So how has that changed from Tolkien to Star Wars, Star Trek, and other modern language inventions?
I think the palette has become a lot richer because you've got lots of different people inventing languages. Tolkien was drawing upon from the languages that he loved. So certainly Finnish for Quenya, Welsh for Sindarin, Latin for some of the structure and things like that. But then when David Peterson created the Dothraki language for, Game of Thrones, he incorporated the elements of Arabic into it and stuff like that. So you have a much wider palette because you have more people inventing languages. I think what persists though is that idea that, so there's this theory of called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which means that language meaning shapes language. So in other words, if you have, a good example of the Dothraki, who are the horsemen of the Essos, basically. And so the way that they say, how are you, is, I'll get it wrong, Dothrachek, which means, how are you riding? Because all of their language is oriented by what they do, which is ride horses, basically. So the Sapir-Whorf kind of is still there, and you see that in a lot of invented languages. I mean, I think even though the languages may sound completely crazy, there is still a structure to them, because and a lot of people who invent languages are, I mean, the conlanging society is just an amazing society, and they invent languages just to invent languages, basically. And I've met some amazing people who literally spend hours inventing these languages just for the sake, the secret vice, or not so secret vice, of inventing languages and writing systems too, which is another area of the, and the artisticness of the writing systems and things like that. So yeah, I think we have a much richer palette to draw upon. I think at the base of it, though, there is always that thing. If you're going to invent a language, you need to come up with a phonetic system. You need to come up with some kind of grammar, and you need to come up with a way for it to be expressed. And also, as a as a very amateur language inventor myself, and believe me, there's not enough time in my life to do it, keeping track of it all is just crazy. So yeah, but I know there are people out there. Dominique Babou is an amazing one. I follow him on Twitter, who just invent languages for the sake of inventing languages, which Tolkien, I think, would have. It would have blown his mind, but I think he would have loved it. And of course, he was interested in invented languages like Esperanto, which were created to kind of simplify language and bring people together and stuff like that. Yeah, so I think that we have a much wider palette to choose from now.
Yeah, wasn't Esperanto created as sort of a universal communication language? So
yeah,
with the thought that it would have been easier for people who came from different countries to speak one unified language.
Yeah, it's what was called an auxiliary language, and there were several of them. Esperanto was the one that got the most kind of use and everything. It was invented by a Polish eye doctor named Zamhoff. And there's actually an Esperanto museum in Vienna that you can go to, and you could see the documents. And Tolkien, at the start of his Secret Vice talk, kind of uses Esperanto as a way to get in. And then he basically says, but now I'm going to tell you the real subject of this paper. And Dimitra and I had a lot of fun trying to figure out where he gave this paper, because no one knew, and when he gave the paper. And we finally found out that he gave it at the Samuel Johnson Society at Pembroke College in November 1931, and it was to a group of students. So I think the fact that it's called The Secret Vice might be because Tolkien thought that would be an interesting title to get people to come to a lecture, basically.
Sure. So in co-editing A Secret Vice with Professor Dimitra Fimi now. Yes. Professor Dimitra Fimi.
Absolutely.
Yes. So what were some of the things that you discovered about Tolkien and about language invention while researching this particular lecture? What surprised you the most when you were conducting this research?
Well, it was an interesting process because when I started it, and again, I was working on my PhD, Dimitra had already discovered in the folder at the Bodleian where all the papers were kept. And let's remember that Christopher had published The Secret Vice in Monsters and the Critics in 1983. So it was out there. But what was not out there, and which Dimitra had been working on for a while, especially with Tolkien's atrocious handwriting, was this essay on phonetic symbolism, which was Tolkien thinking out loud about what does this idea of phonoaesthetics mean. I mean, he starts by basically saying, what do I mean by this? Things like that. And So that was one. And then the other thing that we discovered when we were going through the manuscript, which is an amazing process when you're actually looking at the papers and everything, was these several pieces of paper about this weird language called Funwegian, which Christopher had not published in the talk. And I remember transcribing it. And the amazing thing was when we eventually found the minutes to the meeting at Pembroke College, which was very late in the process. I mean, we were about to publish this thing without knowing where Tolkien had given this talk, and then something finally came out. The only invented language mentioned in the minutes was Professor Tolkien talked about this Funwegian language. Now, I've not been able to find, and we asked, I believe we asked Christopher, I think we asked around, no one knew anything about this Funwegian language. The only thing is, he does also have a page of notes about Gulliver's Travels and some of the words in Gulliver's Travels. And when you look at Funwegian, and it's interesting because he kind of introduces it by saying he discovered this manuscript of this language that's spoken in the island of Funway called Funwegian. And so, I mean, we're still trying to figure out what he means by it. Did he make this up? Was it a language? I'm kind of leaning into the idea that he might have invented it in the 1920s when he was at Leeds, but I can't prove that. Other people think he just made it up on the spot, basically, as one of these found manuscripts thing. But this was a completely new language that no one had heard of before. So it was amazing to find those documents and then transcribe those and put them into the speech. And then there were lots of really interesting notes in the back of different versions and stuff like that. So, but for me, the revelation was the Funwegian, which, you know, if he were to come back, the one question I would ask him is, what was this Funwegian? You know, and the new letters are coming out, you know, the new version of the letters, with lots of new letters in it. And I'm praying there's something in there about Funwegian, but I'm sure there won't be. But I keep looking. And I did write, it's on the Journal of Tolkien Research. I did write a paper, which I gave at a conference and then posted there about some other ideas on Funwegian and things like that. And other people have had ideas about it as well. But I just thought that was brilliant because that was something no one had ever seen before. And Christopher had not included in the original publishing. And yet here it was. And it's, you know, it's got examples of vocabulary. It's got a bit of a grammar. So it was something. And it must have been memorable enough for it to have gotten to the minutes of the meeting. Whereas when Tolkien did whole things about Quenya and Noldorin at that point, it wasn't Sindarin yet, and none of that was picked up in the minutes, but the Funwegian was. So for me, it's a constant journey. Yeah, sure. Exactly. Yeah.
I wonder, is there a reason Christopher didn't include it? If that was on purpose, or was it something that Christopher hadn't noticed before?
I don't know. I mean, it wasn't in. So basically, in the kind of manuscript, it was separate papers. So it wasn't included in the manuscript with the rest of the Secret Vice talk. So he may have thought this was something separate. You know, he didn't include the essay on phonetic symbolism either.
Okay.
Or he didn't. Maybe I don't know. I don't know. But it's published now. So anyone who wants to read it, it's in Secret Vice, and I welcome anyone to take a crack at it and try to figure out what it is.
Hey, I mean, it's a project, isn't it?
Well, that's why we wanted to get it out there, so students could have it and, you know, and dig into it and stuff. And that's what probably one of the most rewarding things, besides having Verlin Flieger ask you to sign a copy of Secret Vice, which for me I will never forget, is seeing Dimitra and I's work kind of quoted in other works, basically, and people digging into it and stuff like that. And that's what this whole academic discussion is about, you know. And if someone out there wants to try to crack Funwegian, please go right ahead.
You heard it here. If you want to have a crack at Funwegian, give it a go. So tell us about your chapters in Star Trek and Star Wars. These are new volumes co-edited by Amy H. Sturgis and Emily Strand. In both of these chapters, in both of these books, you refer to glossopaic journeys. You're from Utini. Oh goodness, I'm not going to pronounce these correctly. Oh dear. To Alit Orisha
Odisha
Taldin.
Taldin.
There
Yes.
it is. The glossopaic journey of Star Wars and the glossopasis. Oh dear. Exploring the glossopoesis of the Star Wars universe. Let's see this.
Yeah.
Dif Torhe Smoosh. No dear. Nope.
Yeah.
Nope. I can't do it. My tongue.
So that's Div Torhe Shmusma is
Shmusma.
the movie version of the Vulcan Live Long and Prosper. And if you'll notice, if you say Div Torhe Shmusma, Live Long and Prosper, it's almost the same phonetically, because it basically had to be ADR'd in the movie process from Leonard Nimoy saying live long and prosper to Div Torhe Shmusa. So that's something that happens in language invention for movies. They have to match when they do what's called the post-production, and the actor comes in and dubs whatever was said in English into the language. It has to match the mouth movement.
It does, yeah. So it has to match the phonetics and the syllabic content as well.
Exactly.
Ooh.
Yeah. So if you watch, especially Star Trek II, the Wrath of Khan, in the scene when Leonard Nimoy and Kirstie Alley are in the elevator and they're speaking Vulcan, watch the mouth movements very carefully, because they film that in English, and then they put on the Vulcan on top of it.
I had no idea. That's amazing.
So, and that was invented by Mark Orkrand, who would later then invent Klingon as well.
Right.
So this project came about because I took Amy's incredibly amazing Signum University courses on Star Trek and Star Wars. I actually took 2 on Star Wars because she updated it. And they're available from Signum, and they're incredible. And at the time, Amy said they were working on 1 volume about Star Trek and Star Wars. So I wrote an abstract, basically looking at the 2 languages the 2 language worlds. And glossopaic is just a fancy word for language making. Poesis is making, glosso is tongue. So just like mythopoesis is the making of myth, basically. So it's just a fancy term. And I wrote an abstract, and then I got a response back saying, actually, we want to do 2 books, one on Star Trek and one on Star Wars. Would you split your abstract up into 2? And I thought that was great. So what I find fascinating about these languages is when you look at Star Wars, the genesis of the Star Wars languages, starting with Utini, which is what the Jawas say in A New Hope. Ben Burtt was the sound designer for Lucasfilm. And George Lucas told him to go out and record sounds that could be made into dialogue for a language, for different things. So, for example, they thought that with Chewbacca, he should sound like a bear. So Ben went out and he recorded in zoos baby bears. And then he was in San Francisco, and he was at the pier one day, and he heard these walruses being very upset because their pool was being drained. So he recorded them. And he mixed that together, and that became Chewbacca. And when you hear Chewbacca, that's what you're hearing. You're hearing bears, and you're hearing very angry walruses, basically. For the Sand people, that guy, when they were filming in Tunisia, they used to use donkeys to bring in all the equipment to the set on Tatooine. And Ben Burtt recorded the braying of the donkeys, and that became the of the Sand people. So basically, there were 3 types of sounds. There were animal sounds, there were electronic sounds, and the hardest one to do is R2D2, which had to sound, if you read the original script, I mean, Lucas literally has what R2 is saying, and then that was turned into the beep, beep, beeps and all that. But the beeping had to have almost like a baby sound to it. So they mixed in baby sounds into this electronic beeping sound, basically. And then the third one, and this was the problematic one as we look back on it now, unfortunately, is that Burtt used indigenous languages, people speaking things like Quechua and stuff like that. And of course, now we know that is, it's cultural misappropriation, and not the way to do language invention. But I don't, they didn't know that at the time, of course. So you have the Ewoks, you have the Jawas, things like that. So in a very different way than other languages of invention, it really did start with sound. And so if you'll notice in the movies, you hear Chewbacca make these sounds. Han Solo understands, but we don't understand. But the sound, and then they use subtitles. So like for Greedo, for example, who speaks Ubis, you get the subtitles when in the scene in Mos Eisley when he shoots him, or Hansel, whoever shoots, that's it. So it was pretty much that way for the first three movies, the holiday special, which we want to talk about, and the prequels. And then eventually Bert published what was called the Galactic Guide to the Universe, which is where he started codifying these into languages with syntax and stuff like that. And from that, we get the languages of today. And so my chapter starts with Utini, which is that language, and it ends with a passage from Mandoa, which is one of the newest invented languages, which is used for the Mandalorian and was also very briefly heard in Ashoka, if you've been watching Ashoka. And so Star Wars languages had a very interesting genesis, and now they more settled into the more traditional grammar languages. With Star Trek, it started again with the idea, the Klingons are introduced in an episode from the original series called Errand of Mercy, but they're not speaking Klingon, they're speaking English. But then in Trouble with Tribbles, there is a line when they're trying to rile up the crew when they're on shore leave, and the Klingon guy says that people are learning the Klingon language because they know the Federation will fall or something like that. So there's a mention of the Klingon. And the only hint we get are in the names. They're all very hard sounding. It's like Cax and Crack and all this kind of stuff. When they wanted to do the movie in 1979, the first movie, Gene Roddenberry decided that there should be some kind of Klingon language, especially in that opening scene with Vija and everything. And so actually, James Doohan, who played Scotty, created a Klingon language, which really had no it was just made up words, basically. And then they worked with another linguist named Helmut Pusch. You could read about it in the chapter. It wasn't until Star Trek, The Search for Spock, that they hired Mark Okrand, who had done some work on Star Trek II, the Vulcan, to create a Klingon language with a structure and a grammar. And that's when you start to get things like the Klingon dictionary and all of that. And so in my chapter, I look at three kind of genesis. I look at the genesis of the Vulcan languages. And again, like I said earlier, that started with a fan invention, actually, and then moved into the canon. Romulan, which has a very interesting genesis. I won't go into it all now, read the chapter. And then Klingon, which of course has now become, outside of the Star Trek universe, a language in its own right. There are over, I think it's 2,000 speakers of Klingon. And there was even a guy who tried to raise his child only in the Klingon language, Darman Spears. And I think he got to about 4 or 5 years old, and then he realized, he needed to speak normal English. So that's a really interesting one, because it's almost become its own auxiliary language, like Esperanto, basically. Not a very easy language to speak. Lots of gutturals and things like that, and a very complicated syntax, I must say. I know it pretty well, but you could take a Duolingo course in both. Well, you could take a Duolingo course in Klingon and High Valyrian from Game of Thrones, and I think Dothraki. So yeah, so it was really interesting to trace the development of these languages. But what I also found really interesting is the fan engagement, and how fans actually started, because they wanted to become part of these worlds, how language invention became a way in to that, basically. So it's not just about fan fiction and things like that, which is very important. And it's also about people engaging with these worlds through the languages.
And in a way, they're creating their own culture as a fan base with these
Yeah.
languages.
Well, you have, some of this with the Vulcan languages. There was someone that created a whole fan fiction series called The Kraith, which included a Vulcan language, another version of a Vulcan language. So I went through very carefully and looked at each of those phases, and you could read about that in the chapter. But yeah, fascinating stuff. And then, of course, the really fascinating thing was the fact that a word that the fans invented for Vulcan called Nivar, which means kind of two feelings. It's how Spock expressed his human and Vulcan side. Later on, when they were doing Discovery and they needed the name for the planet that Vulcan and Romulan would share, they called it Nivar. So, yeah, it's incredible how something invented by a fan in the 60s would then become part of canon later on.
That's amazing. And that tends to, that I've seen a lot of that happen, especially with Star Wars as well. What happens, almost this nostalgia of the fan base gets incorporated into later works as series. And, we have new series with Dave Filoni, we have new Star Wars, Star Trek, constantly growing out of the originals. Yeah. And without the fans, that would not happen.
No. And it gives, actors like Hayden Christensen a chance to come back as Force ghosts or, things like that.
Yeah. Oh, my heart is just so happy for Hayden Christensen. And
he's brilliant.
Oh my goodness. I mean, people were mean. People were mean at the prequels. My goodness.
Oh, I know. I thought he was brilliant.
He was brilliant.
I thought that. Well, I don't know. I don't want to ruin it, but if you've seen Ashoka and that episode is amazing.
I finished the series a couple days ago. I think I cried a little bit. I won't lie, just a little bit.
Yeah, I need to have a conversation with Amy Sturgis about those Mortis statues at the end at some point.
Me too. I knew it. I knew there were Mortis statues. I knew they were the Mortis gods. I was questioning myself for a minute. I'm like, is that the father? That's got to be the father. That's got to be the father, right?
It's not the Argonauts. No,
no, it's very Argonaut-like, though. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I think Dave Filoni. Well, and let's not even go into
Filoni knows exactly what he's doing.
Oh God, Ashoka being Gandalf the White. I mean, come on. I mean,
come on. It's a little more than just a parallel. Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But there was there again a very interesting new language called for the Noti. The little ones that Ezra was with.
The Noti. Oh my goodness!
And I need to dig into who invented, because they had it. They were talking, and Ezra understood them.
Yeah.
But yeah, another whole language we need to explore.
Another whole language, and I find it really interesting. The difference between a language system and a writing system, because those can be two very different things. I mean, when I introduced Tolkien's writing systems to my students, they went, wait a minute, that's how it's very different from the sounds in the language. It's a different representation of I'm sorry, I'm going off no. It's a bit of a tangent, but yeah, they were fascinated by it.
Tolkien was not a big fan of the alphabet. He didn't think that the alphabet expressed words phonetically, and it doesn't. The alphabet is ridiculous. No. It doesn't know that. So when he invented the Tangwar and the Kirth and all that, but I mean, I've seen some amazing writing systems. I mean, and David Peterson is one for that. And then Star Wars, we have Arabesh, which is kind of the basic one. And then there's also the Sith writing system, which is really interesting. So yeah, there's a whole piece to be done on writing systems and stuff like that. Yeah.
Wonderful. Definitely. All right. So I'm a reading interventionist. So my job, as I described before we started recording, my job is to help students learn how to read and read in the English language, because I do work with a lot of students who are from other countries and speak different languages. I've got mostly students from Brazil who speak Portuguese, and students from Spanish-speaking countries in South America. And I also have a few Arabic students as well. So I'm constantly thinking about the roots of languages and roots of English that I can use to sort of bridge between these multiple languages. And recently, and this is why invented languages has been on my mind recently, I had to give an assessment to my students to measure their fluency, how quickly and how fluently do they read what we call nonsense words. So these nonsense words, they're based in English, but they follow English phonetic patterns. So you've got, your digraphs and your blends, short A sounds, long A sounds. They follow these patterns, but they're made up words. So if I were, I would give students words like hap, lum, chit, like things that there's still this basis in English, but they didn't have to worry about the meaning. It was assessing how quickly they could read, how quickly they could decode and encode and read these words all the way through. It's called the Dibble's Nonsense Word Fluency Exam.
Wow.
So, right. So my job was not to see if they understood the words, but to see if they understood the patterns of the English language and how they put those together. And there's, tons of other considerations I had to take into place, such as, if they pronounced a letter differently, was it because of their original language and how they would pronounce that sound? Or is it because they didn't understand that particular phonic pattern? But that's another digression for another day. So I want to know how to bring invented languages into the classroom. What are some ways that teachers could use invented languages in their own classrooms? That could be, a primary or a secondary educator or a university educator. How could we use invented languages to help our students, do you think?
I think one of the ways that invented languages could be really helpful is to teach structure, sentence structure and things like that. And, if you tell someone they have to invent a language and they have to come up with a structure, like, okay, so what's the first thing we're going to need? We're going to need some words. So, you want to invent a language for, a race of elves, let's say, and they live in the forest. So you're going to need some vocabulary to describe what the elves are seeing. So come up with some words. Okay, come up with some words. Okay, now you want to express some sentences. So you're going to need to think about what's the word that's going to be the subject of that sentence? How are you going to express that? And how are you going to signify that, basically? And how are you going to differentiate that from the object, for example? Okay, well, now you've taught them that there is a subject and an object in a sentence. And then you're going to need to express some kind of motion about what that thing is doing. Is it doing something? Is it being done to something? So then you're going to have to come up with a verb, so okay, so then you're going to come up with a verb. Okay, so now you're going to need to distinguish different forms of the verb based on if someone's, if the elf is looking at the tree, then then you have to have a third person, and then you can start to explain how verbs work. So I think it's because I always think about those awful classes I used to have to take about diagramming sentences and things like that and stuff like that, and how dry and boring that is. And if you use language invention and you're inventing the language, then you can come up with a whole system to teach them all those different, what's an ablative, what's a genitive, what's an accusative, by using language invention, because they're engineering it, basically. So I think that could be good. I think the other thing that would be, you could teach them through language invention is how, nouns, the singulars and plurals, and the different ways that nouns become plural, with endings, with infixes, with, mutation, for example. You could probably teach the ablut in a really fun, interesting way through language invention versus trying to, show them the six forms of an Anglo-Saxon verb or something like that. So I think it kind of breaks down that barrier, because then they're engineering the language instead of just being given something that you have to study. That's the verb and that's the subject. So I think that could be an interesting way of doing that. And I think that's I remember reading, might have been in this book about teachers using language invention in that way, basically. So yeah, and I think it makes it fun too, so it isn't dry stuff like that. This is the book we were
Language Invention in Linguistics Pedagogy. Yes.
Yeah, and it's really good. So yeah, I think that could be a fun way of doing it. And then maybe with vocabulary, it's how do you make a word? You know, what are the elements that come together to make a word, basically? What does an ending do to a word? You know, things like that. So yeah, I think you can make grammar fun.
Exactly.
It
It's
wasn't
one
for me
thing
when
to,
I was growing up.
no, not me either. I remember, oh goodness, I took Anglo-Saxon with Nelson Goring, and I was in the lectures
The
were
master,
by Michael Drought. And I just
another
remember,
master.
oh my goodness. And I just it did something to my brain, because I had to go all the way back to my school days of, diagramming these sentences, whether it was for English or for Latin. I had to take Latin in 6th grade,
Yeah.
and having to understand conjugations. And it was hard because I was going back to the basics in a way. And
Yeah, and a lot
so,
of these historical grammars
yeah.
were written for people who had all that background in their education. So
Mm-hmm.
when you read these old 1920 grammars, everyone knew what a nominative, a genitive, a dative, an ablative, an accusative, you know, what was an ablative absolute, all that. Nowadays,
Mm-mm.
people don't,
We
you
don't
know.
know.
You could write a really interesting class or course, basically having the students throughout the semester invent their own language and use that as a way to teach all of those rather dry grammatical things. What's a relative pronoun and how does that
Mm-hmm.
work? So how would that work in your language, you know, stuff like that. So
Exactly.
yeah.
I cannot wait to put some of these ideas to the test. Might be a little while, but we'll see. So I would love to know what sources you would recommend for someone who wants to study more about invented languages. What would you recommend for teachers? What would you recommend to linguistic nerds like us? What would you recommend?
Well, obviously a secret advice.
Of course, that one I think goes without saying. A secret
That
vice
goes
is
without
top on
saying.
your list.
Yeah. But then the other one that I really think is brilliant was the art of language, the art of language invention by David Peterson. Because
Mm-hmm.
what I like about this, I mean, he is a language inventor. You know, he wrote Dothraki and High Valyrian, but he also goes through in a very, not simple is not the right word, but just a very layman's way, all the different things you need in an invented language. And I go back to this again and again. I think it's brilliant. And of course he knows, because that's what he does for a living,
Mm-hmm.
basically. There's another good book from Oxford University Press called From Elvish to Klingon, which has some really good chapters in it about language invention. There's the Encyclopedia of Invented Languages by Conley and Kane, which is excellent. Umberto Eco's book on the search for the search for the perfect language is really interesting. I'm trying to think of what else. And of course, I mean, language invention is also a very important part of world building. So anything by Mark J.P. Wolf about world building is really, really good, including the chapter that Dimitra and I wrote on Tolkien's invented languages in the Routledge Companion to World Building is good. Yeah, but I think if someone wants to learn how invented languages work, David Peterson is the way to go. He's just brilliant. And then there's a wonderful book which Dimitra recommended to me when I was doing my PhD, which is great. It's called Lunatic Lovers of Language by Maria Jaguello. And that has some really good stuff, especially about Hildegard von Bingen. Oh, there's another wonderful book by Sarah Higley about Hildegard von Bingen, but it also has a lot of great stuff about Ursula Le Guin and a couple of other language inventors. And it's a Palgrave book. It's brilliant. I could send you the link to it if you want. You could share it.
Please do.
Actually, if you look in Secret Vice, we did a bibliography, and there's some good stuff in there. I'm trying to think if there's anything a bit more recent. I mean, anything. It's not a published thing, but James Tauber is doing a lot of work on Tolkien, digital Tolkienist. That's really, really good.
Absolutely.
And that's got some good language invention in it. Yeah, I think that's it. But for a more general view, and the Constructed Language Society, the website has a lot of good resources on it. That's where the Language Construction Society, LCS, Language Construction Society. There is a new book coming out about language invention that I was at the conference for it, but I couldn't do the paper went into the chapter for Star Trek. So, but that's coming out by Stephen. It's coming out from Nottingham Press. So be on the lookout for that. Yeah, but there's a lot. It's a very, very rich field now. So there's a lot of good stuff coming out.
Excellent. I cannot wait to pile those sources together. It's such an exciting field, and it's really exciting to see like what comes out of our own cultures and how we can bring these to our students, because grammar doesn't have to be boring. You know, we remember our boring grammar days, and it doesn't have to be boring. We can make it our own.
No, and the other thing, if people are interested in Tolkien, of course, a lot of his language materials, not all of it, there's still more to go. Much better. There's more to go, but a lot of it's been published in the Parma Elder Lambarans and the Vinyar Tangwars. So we're up to about 1940. But he wrote, I mean, so basically, when Christopher was going through all of his father's papers, he realized he wasn't going to be able to do all the language stuff along with all the history of Middle Earth. So he gave it to a group of language scholars, basically, to publish, and they've been publishing it for a while now. But we have a lot of the early stuff. We have everything up to about the 1940s or so. And then he also published Parma Elder Lambaran 17, his words, phrases, and Lord of the Rings, which was the original appendix that Tolkien was going to publish with all the language stuff about Lord of the Rings. So if anyone's interested in Tolkien, those are the sources to go to, basically.
Parma Elder Lambaran 17. I've heard that one cited quite a few times.
Yeah.
By our favorite Tolkien scholars.
Absolutely. There's a lot in there.
Yeah. And Carl Hofstadter's work, I think, is really shedding a lot of light on. I mean, he's taken over as part of the Parma Elder Lambaran project, hasn't he?
Well, he's always been he's been one of them for a while. It's been Carl, it's been Patrick Wynn, it's been Arden Smith, Chris Gilson, who's amazing. And they are doing it in a very slow, methodical way, which is great, because when they're published, they are fully annotated with lots of notes, and they are an amazing resource. But there's more to go.
Always. That's the great thing about Tolkien scholarship, is it's always growing, isn't it?
Keeps coming. I mean, we got Nature of Middle Earth, which, you know, Tolkien in 1959, focusing on Elvish childbirth and things like that.
That was oh my goodness. Math. Lots of math. Not my strongest subject. Not my strongest subject, but I'm getting there.
He was really, I think that was the first year of his retirement, but boy, he really got into lots of maths in that volume.
He did, didn't he? Oh my goodness.
I know.
I remember going to the Morgan Library exhibit. It was in the Bodleian's Art of the, no, it wasn't Art of the Manuscript.
Oh, Art of the Manuscript.
Was it Art of the Manuscript? It might have been.
Yeah, I had the book. Yeah. All his notes.
Maker of Middle Earth. That's the one. Maker of Middle Earth.
Oh, the Bodleian. Yeah,
the Bodleian. It was the Morgan Library showed the Maker of Middle Earth. There's some of the same pieces that were in the Bodleian exhibit over here in New York, and I remember seeing his calculations for how long it would take for the hobbits to get from the Shire to Mordor based on the length of their stride.
Yeah, I know.
That is detailed subcreation right there.
Oh yes, Tolkien got. It's funny. I'm doing the space course right now with the amazing Dr. Sarah Brown on Morgoth's Ring, and what I love about Morgoth's Ring, it's when Tolkien kind of comes back to the Silmarillion materials after writing Lord of the Rings, and he really gets into the weeds of world building, you know, and it is amazing, because he's kind of almost looking back on all the stuff he wrote earlier, as with a student looking back at old mythology, and then trying to explain and make sense. And I think he also realized, with the popularity of Lord of the Rings, that people were going to take this stuff seriously. And so, yes, things like the length of a gestation of an elvish baby became very important.
And we are asking these questions now, aren't we?
Exactly.
Oh goodness. Like that was even, I think that was even a recent question on the Prancing Pony podcast.
I'm sure it was.
Somebody was asking, no, it was not just the gestation, it was also the gestation plus the length of a baby's or the length of an elvish childhood versus the length, like the difference between Arwen's childhood and Aragorn's childhood. It was very, very, very detailed, and I thought, wow.
Yes, I must dig back into that book. I mean, I read it, and there were parts of it that I found fascinating about Numenor and the dancing bears, of course, and the fact that the Asteri were, the wizards were Cuivianen when the elves woke up. I thought that was really interesting. But then there were other parts that I just kind of went, oh God, I don't know if I can deal with this.
Yeah. I'll leave the calculations to the mathematicians.
Yeah, it's like I leave the astronomy to Christine Larson, who is who's the astronomy guru of all times. And the other math to someone else.
Indeed. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Andy, for agreeing.
Thank you.
Thank you for agreeing to talk to me today. This has been a fantastic episode.
Listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Be sure to hit the subscribe button on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or your other favorite podcast feeds. If you enjoyed listening, please leave a rating and a review as well. You can read and find out more about Teaching with Magic by visiting our website, teachingwithmagic.blog. You can leave a message on our podcast page, read past Teaching with Magic posts, and check out our book lists on our affiliate page. We also invite you to support us on Patreon. You'll have access to bonus material, our Discord channel, live Q&As, and you'll get a sneak peek at future products such as lesson plans, worksheets, and other teaching tools. The link is always available in our show notes and the podcast page on our website. Thanks again for joining us, and as always, keep making magic.